Historians like to let the dust settle for at least a couple of decades before we make pronouncements about the historical import of a particular moment, elections included. But 2016 did have quite a few things in common from elections that have been precipitated pretty significant change and shifts in party structure and governance. And it has some things in common with the elections that I profiled in my book. One of them is the role of new media, the new media of this era being social media, internet-based media, Twitter, the platform of preference for the president-elect, President Trump, and how the fragmentation and the siloing of media has created a new avenues for political discourse, new transparency, things that were once hidden are now immediately seen, many more voices, but also has clearly increased partisanship and polarization, at least in political discourse. Another thing that makes 2016 distinctive, but also has in common with earlier elections that had some seismic effects, is how it both shook the foundations of both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. It's interesting, 6 months before Election Day, the question was, oh, is this the end of the GOP? Is this, is Trump killed it? And he certainly shook it up, and he did not come in, he mowed through all the establishment Republicans quite quickly, and then proceeded to dispatch Hillary Clinton in the general election and seize an electoral college victory on November 8th, 2016. And in doing so, caused a great crisis in the Democratic Party. But really what the Trump candidacy and the win revealed was these existing factionalism and fragility within both parties, the internal debates that both parties are trying to work out. Now, that's not a new thing either. Both the Republican and the Democratic parties have often been uneasy big tents that have had interest groups within them that have not always gotten along. And remarkably, even though a lot of people have concluded, this is the end of this party as we know it, again and again they survive, they adjust to fit. And the incredible durability of the American two-party system and the modern Democratic and Republican Party is a real hallmark of American politics. The elections I wrote about in the book, one thing that 3 of the 4 of them had in common was that there was the presence of an independent third-party candidate that did not win the election but had what I would argue, a disruptive effect, and in two those cases, I think a decisive effect on the outcome. Those 3 elections were 1912, when Teddy Roosevelt ran as a third-party Bull Moose Progressive Party candidate, 1968, when George Wallace was the independent party candidate, did not win as many electoral votes or popular votes as someone like Teddy Roosevelt, but nonetheless, disrupted the field and brought new messages and concerns to the fore. The third of those 3-party races was 1992, when H. Ross Perot, the Texas billionaire, came into the race as a third-party candidate. And even though he was in the race, dropped out, got back in again, he ultimately got enough of the popular vote that Bill Clinton won the election with a plurality, not a majority of the popular vote. And so all 3 of those candidates, Trump has a lot in common with these outsider figures. And even though he became the Republican nominee, he is in many ways has the hallmarks of a George Wallace in his populism and his appeals to some of the baser instincts in the American electorate and certain portions of the American electorate, his anti-elite rhetoric and anti-institutional rhetoric. He has some things in common with Teddy Roosevelt in that he played the media like nobody's business. Theodore Roosevelt, like Donald Trump, was extremely good at getting the media to write about him and to give them good copy and good quotes. And like H. Ross Perot, Donald Trump comes in as positioning himself as a no-nonsense businessman, someone who is railing against free trade and globalization and talking about a new beginning for the American worker who's been left out of the current economic order. There have been a lot of pronouncements floating around these days about this is more America is more partisan and more divided than ever. And that always, raises the historian's antenna, right? Because the sayings, those declarative statements are often what actually the past was like. And if you dial back to the 19th century, for example, you see moments of hyper-partisanship and division. Let's take the 1850s as a case in point. I can't imagine a moment when you would see, a more heightened and ununified American republic, where you have factional divisions, sectional divisions, party divisions, divisions within parties. Both parties are unstable, changing. You have third parties rising up. You have aging leadership of the two major parties that are having a hard time holding on to power. And with that, just as today, you have a very cacophonous and raucous and highly partisan media environment that has lots of different outlets and lots of different voices saying their piece. And because in the 20th century there was this, for the most of the 20th century, there was a mass media, a national media that was nonpartisan in nature, where you don't have partisan newspapers, you don't have Democratic newspaper, Republican newspaper. Well, that was the norm in 18th and 19th century America. Was you knew the partisan or the slant that the political inclinations of a newspaper before you picked it up, and this flattening out and this creation of an ostensibly nonpartisan collective mass media is something that was certainly quite durable for a number of decades, but it is not something that's always been there. I tell my students, my undergraduates, who now get most of their news through Facebook, social media, and other internet outlets, highly fragmented, saying that they're really like 19th century media consumers. They're old school. They're going back to the way that the early 19th century Americans consumed their news or understood politics. We no longer have have gunfights and knife fights on the floors of state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. So it's yes, when you were drawing blood, it's hard to say this is the most divided we've ever been. One really interesting way that you see how the changing economy has reflected and also been a catalyst for changing political parties at a national level in the United States has been looking at the high-tech industry and how the high-tech industry's relationship has been with Washington, and how high-tech executives, what their political inclinations are, who they help, and how they vote. So if you go back to the early decades of what became known as Silicon Valley, the 50s, 60s, the early 70s, even into the 80s, you had business leaders in this growing industry. Many of these industries were highly dependent on defense contracts. They were part of the defense complex. They had very close relationships with military leaders as well as political leaders who were interested in a strong defense. And they were, by and large, kind of, their political temperament was typical of many business leaders in that they voted Republican. They were people who were interested in lower taxes. They, in fact, in the late 70s, advocated for lowering the capital gains tax, for example. Silicon Valley started to have a political voice in Washington in the 70s and 80s around this question of lowering taxes and regulatory burdens around businesses in a way that was kind of similar to other sectors, but was also appealing to their political appeal was in part because they were a growth industry at a time when industries weren't growing. Starting in the 1980s, there becomes a shift, and high-tech industries and the Democratic Party start forming new alliances. And this really starts with a new generation of Democrats who are up and coming in the 1980s, people who are also running for president, like Gary Hart in 1984 and 1988, Bill Clinton in 1992. Who are aligning themselves very visibly with the high-tech industry, who want to get some of its sheen, but also see these industries as the future of the American economy. And they, in doing so, also are proponents of policies that help the high-tech industry, not only economic policies, tax and regulatory policies, but also ones that allow a certain degree of freedom in communication, that telecommunication reform, encouragement of growth of these different industries. And so by the time you get to now, you have a Silicon Valley that is overwhelmingly Democratic in terms of where its industry titans, who they give money to. The disparity between the amount of money that Hillary Clinton raised in Silicon Valley and other tech areas in 2016 and how much Donald Trump raised was night and day. Peter Thiel was really the only visible Silicon Valley power player who was vocally for Trump, and there were very few other people who were in that column. So, and this, I think, shows how the Democratic Party kind of accommodated the interests and needs of very large companies, Silicon Valley included. Silicon Valley's gone from being these littlest constellation of electronics companies on the side of the economy to becoming some of the biggest and most influential corporations in the world, whose products are used every day by millions, if not billions, of people. They have the highest market capitalization of any companies on the planet. And so that shift, you can see those connections, and the connection between Silicon Valley likes to talk about how it, doesn't have anything to do with politics and government. It's independent. It has this sort of free market, almost libertarian ethos that at least that's the way it's interpreted more broadly. But if you actually dig down, you see a real whole constellation of different political impulses going on, and you see this really close connection between political change and economic change. The really interesting thing about, as someone who dug deep into the 1992 election in my book, and I also worked as a staffer straight out of college on the Clinton campaign in 1992. That was my first job, and I call it working in Washington, which I subsequently did, was my first graduate school. It informs what I do as a historian very much. But I was struck in 2016 by how much it was 1992 all over again. Not only the fact that you had Bushes and Clintons in the mix, and you also had Donald Trump, who's been a public figure since the 1980s, right? But that the issues and the rhetoric was so familiar. The promises that both candidates were making to blue-collar America, and sort of whose face was kind of a white working class face in the upper Midwest, even though blue-collar America or working-class America is much more multiracial and much more geographically dispersed than the pigeonholing of that interest group seems to be popularly. But both of them are talking about, we're going to restore the manufacturing greatness. We're going to bring this back, and had different ways of talking about it and different means by which to do it. Hillary Clinton emphasized the importance of, a broader social compact about things like child care and health care and making it easier for working families to get along. Very similar to the way that her husband talked about that in 1992. Talked a lot about working families, both in the Clinton 92 and Clinton 2016 were a lot about working families in very similar ways. And some of the same people were crafting that message. Trump was very much like Ross Perot in this very kind of dramatic, apocalyptic language about jobs going to Mexico. Perot was warning against NAFTA, and Trump was saying, look what NAFTA did to us. But NAFTA becomes a proxy for kind of this bigger transformations in the American economy. Now the reality is, yes, global free trade has had this, true impact on American manufacturing, but so has automation. So have a whole host of other things, demographic, geographic, economic, and technological changes that have been going on and accumulating for an era far longer than the, recent decades of political rhetoric about it. And so to say, we're going to, have a new approach to trade and that's going to solve everything, is not going to be the answer. But it was really remarkable to me, and I think what it did show, and I think this is what voters were, when they were going to the voting booth, one of the things that some of these voters were thinking about was all of the promises that the candidates, all three candidates in 92, Clinton, Bush, and Perot, were making to that working class, those working families, and saying, we are going to fix this. Well, the two major parties haven't fixed it. It's been 24 years later, and some of these towns and cities have gone from bad to worse. And so you can understand why some voters said, you know what? I think the whole system's broken, and if we're going to have someone, maybe Donald Trump he's a total disruptor, but maybe that's what we need. Maybe I don't like the guy, but what we need is someone who's really going to shake this thing up. And Hillary Clinton is going to be the answer for that. We don't know yet. And I think it's important to say that over and over, and remind people who are out in the public realm, political pundits, all sorts of people who are trying to crystal ball gaze at the moment, that we all need to take a deep breath and see, it's not clear what may happen. It certainly is there will be many history books written about this election. And what it did is it not only stands, we don't know what its impact will be, but certainly it is representative and illustrates the manifestation of forces that both political and otherwise that have been building for a really long time. Donald Trump did not come out of nowhere. There have been political figures like Donald Trump in American politics throughout the history of the Republic, on both sides, all ends of the political spectrum. The kind of populist demagogue figure is a very familiar one. I think one of the things that made it, in a way, made historians like me discount the possibility that Donald Trump would win was because the people like him before have not. George Wallace didn't win the presidency. Huey Long, you know, had he lived to run for president, I doubt he would have garnered that sort of support. Who knows? But William Jennings Bryan didn't win again and again and again. So, the language he used, the anxieties and the prejudices to which he was appealing are something that have been long-standing. Similarly, both the Democratic and Republican parties have been transforming over time. It's been a half-century long transformation that the results of which are being manifested in 2016. What's happening in terms of, you know, who sees himself as a Democrat, who sees himself as a Republican, and the large number of people who say, I'm neither, even though they tend to vote one way or the other. The changes in the media environment that also have been accumulating over time, the interest groups, both within the media and outside of it, that have been, building, creating a kind of conservative worldview and a liberal worldview, these two silos in which American voters now exist. It's very hard to be a moderate and to be in the middle of that. They're two very hyper-partisan silos. Those have been being built gradually over quite a bit of time. And here at the AHA 2017, I've had the privilege to sit in some really interesting panels that have pointed out how far this goes back. And so where historians come into the conversation, I think in a really productive way, is not to be the downers in the conversation, although we can provide a reality check to people who might be overly optimistic about the rapidity of change, but also to show the deeper roots of the current political environment. And in understanding those roots, that's where people who want to change something about it can think about what those instruments of change can be. How has change occurred in the past? How has grassroots activism? How has formal political engagement and everything else? What effect has that had and what has been effective? We can learn from that. But we also have to reckon with that these are broader and longer, there's a longer time horizon at work here, that things don't turn on a dime.